The hammer blows rang out across the Kansas plain like a heartbeat that refused to quit, and every soul in Granger's Hollow knew that Louis Boone was building something far too large for a man who lived entirely alone. It was the spring of 1879, when Louis first broke ground on the eastern edge of his property, just beyond the line of cottonwood trees that marked where his wheat fields ended and the open grassland began. The land out there was good land, dark and flat and honest, the kind of land that rewarded a man who worked it without complaint. Louis had worked it for 4 years already, arriving in Granger's Hollow as a young man of 23 with 2 horses, a deed purchased through a land office in Dodge City, and a quiet sort of grief that he wore the way some men wore a scar. Nobody in town could tell you exactly what that grief was about. He didn't talk much, Louis Boone. He smiled when smiled at, nodded when nodded to, paid for his supplies at Mac Credy's general store with coin and without argument, and rode back out to his land before the sun got too high. He was 27 when he started building the house, and the first thing anyone noticed was how deep he dug the foundation. Silas Prout, who ran the feed store and had an opinion on everything, rode past on his sorrel mare one Tuesday morning and pulled up short at the sight of Louis down in a trench with a shovel, moving earth like he had a personal disagreement with it. "That foundation's deep enough to bury a horse," Silas called out. Louis looked up, wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. "Building to last," he said simply, and went back to digging. Silas rode on and told his wife, who told the postmistress, who told the minister's wife, and by Sunday the whole congregation knew that Louis Boone was putting in a foundation that could hold a building the size of the church itself. People came up with reasons to ride past his property that spring. They would slow their wagons or their horses when they passed the cottonwood line, and they would look, and they would count the rooms taking shape as the weeks turned warmer and the frame began to rise against the enormous Kansas sky. It was not a small house. That much was certain. The frame went up wide and tall, with a broad covered porch wrapping around the front and part of the side, the kind of porch that invited people to sit on it in the evening and watch the sun go down. There were rooms enough for a family, a proper kitchen with space for a big stove, a sitting room with room for a settee and chairs, 2 bedrooms upstairs and 1 on the ground floor, and a separate little room that nobody could quite make sense of, tucked in behind the kitchen with its own small window facing the vegetable garden. Nobody asked him why. That was the thing. They were all curious enough to stare, curious enough to gossip, but not one person in Granger's Hollow gathered the nerve to walk up to Louis Boone and say plainly, "Who is this house for?" Maybe it was his quietness that stopped them. Maybe it was the set of his shoulders, broad and purposeful, that made him seem unreachable. Maybe they thought it was none of their business, though it certainly occupied enough of their conversation. Louis worked on the house through the long summer of 1879 and straight through into the autumn. He built steadily, the way he did everything, without rushing and without stopping. He framed the walls himself, though he hired a man named Chester Webb from the neighboring town of Caldwell to help him raise the rafters, because that was a job that needed more than 2 hands. Chester Webb was a talkative sort who asked questions like most men breathed, without thinking about it first. "You got family coming?" Chester asked on the second day, holding a rafter beam while Louis hammered. "Not at the moment," Louis said. "Wife?" Chester pressed. "Not at the moment," Louis said again, in exactly the same tone. Chester Webb told his wife when he got home, and his wife thought that was the saddest thing she had ever heard, and she cried a little, and then she made a pie for Chester's supper and said a prayer for Louis Boone, whom she had never met and never would. The house was not finished that first autumn. The frame was up, and the roof was on before the first frost came, which was the important thing, and Louis worked through what he could of the winter, finishing the interior walls and the floors, laying down wide planks of pine that he had hauled in from a mill 40 miles distant. He worked by lantern in the evenings. the light glowing yellow in the empty windows while the cold pressed in from outside, and the coyotes called to each other across the dark grassland. In the spring of 1880, he started on the finishing work. He built the kitchen cabinets himself, jointing the wood with a care that nobody required of him. He built a fireplace in the sitting room from limestone blocks he quarried and hauled himself, fitting them together with a patience that bordered on devotion. He built the porch railing from turned posts, each one identical to the last, running his hand along each finished post before he moved to the next. He planted rose bushes along the front of the porch, because rose bushes took years to establish, and he was thinking in terms of years. He planted a kitchen garden with beds already turned and ready, though there was nothing planted in them yet. The town watched all of this and formed no complete theory. There were those who thought he had a sweetheart somewhere back east who had promised to come west when he had a proper home ready. There were those who thought he had lost a wife or a child, or a family in some tragedy he carried silently, and was building this house as a monument to what should have been. There were those who thought he had simply gone a little strange from too much solitude, which the frontier did to some men, and that the house was the outward expression of an inward longing he couldn't name. All of them were partly right, and none of them were fully right, and Louis kept his own counsel and kept building. It was in the late summer of 1880, with the house approaching completion, that the stagecoach from Dodge City arrived in Granger's Hollow carrying, among its regular passengers and cargo, a woman named Lydia Fletcher. She stepped down from the coach into the dust of the main street with a carpet bag in one hand and a hatbox in the other, and she looked around at Granger's Hollow with the expression of a person who is refusing to be discouraged by what they see. The town was not much to look at: a main street of packed earth with a hardware store, a general store, a saloon called the Red Hawk, a livery stable, a barber, a small post office that also served as the telegraph office, a church of modest ambition, and a scattering of houses. There was a sheriff's office with a star-shaped sign that was fading but still legible. The whole thing sat on the flat Kansas plain like something that had been set down there, and not yet decided whether to stay. Lydia Fletcher was 24 years old, and she had come to Granger's Hollow to take up a position as the town's schoolteacher, a position that had been vacant for 8 months since the previous teacher, a Mr. Havorson, had married a widow from Abilene and followed her home. The town had been advertising the position for most of that time, and Lydia had answered the advertisement from a small Ohio town called Millfield, where she had been teaching for 2 years after finishing her education at a normal school in Columbus. She had her reasons for coming west, and they were her own. A situation in Millfield that had become uncomfortable, a man who had not understood the word no, and a community that had expected her to be more understanding of his persistence. She had packed her things with a calmness that had surprised even herself, written to 3 western towns that were advertising for teachers, and accepted the first offer that came back, which was from Granger's Hollow, Kansas. She was not a woman who frightened easily. She was dark-haired and gray-eyed, with a directness to her gaze that people sometimes mistook for coldness before they knew her well enough to understand it was simply honesty. She had opinions she was not afraid to hold, and a laugh that, when it came, transformed her face in a way that made people feel they had been given something. The woman who ran the boarding house where she was to stay, a widow named Mrs. Aldridge, met her at the stage and walked her to the house on the north end of the main street, talking the whole way about the town and the school and the children and the various personalities Lydia would need to navigate. Lydia listened carefully, as was her habit, storing information and asking the occasional precise question. It was Mrs. Aldridge who first told her about Louis Boone, though not immediately. It was several days after Lydia's arrival over supper when the talk turned to who in town was who. "And then there's Louis Boone," Mrs. Aldridge said, passing the biscuits with the air of someone introducing a particularly interesting chapter. "He farms out east of town. Young man, quiet, keeps himself to himself, which I respect, though some people find it peculiar. What's peculiar about being quiet? Lydia asked. Nothing except that for the past 2 years he's been building a house out there, Mrs. Aldridge said, and it is a very large house for a man who lives completely alone. Big porch, kitchen garden, rose bushes, rooms enough for 6 people, and nobody has ever asked him why. Lydia picked up her biscuit and thought about that. Has anyone tried? She asked. Mrs. Aldridge looked uncertain. Well, no, I don't suppose anyone has asked directly. He's just that sort of man. You feel you'd be prying. Seems to me, Lydia said, that the kindest thing might be to ask directly and let him answer however he chooses. Mrs. Aldridge gave her a long look. You might be right about that, she said. You might be exactly right. Lydia's first weeks in Granger's Hollow were occupied entirely with getting the school into order. The schoolhouse was a single room built of lumber that had weathered to silver, with a wood stove in the corner and 23 desks in varying states of repair. The books were outdated and insufficient. The chalkboard was cracked down one side, and several of the window panes were boarded over rather than glazed. She made a list of everything that needed doing and took it to the town council, which consisted of 3 men who met in the back room of Mac Credy's general store on alternating Fridays. She presented her list with the calm certainty of a woman who had done this before, and was prepared to be as patient or as firm as the situation required. The town council, which had been used to its teachers being more deferential, looked at her list and looked at her and then at each other, and then said they would see what they could do. I will also need to call on some of the families, Lydia said as she was leaving, to introduce myself and understand the children's situations at home. Of course, said the council chairman, a man named Gerald Holt. Is there anyone on the outskirts I should be aware of? She asked. Anyone with children who might be of school age. Out east there's Louis Boone, Gerald Holt said, though he has no children, of course. No, Lydia said. He's a bachelor, Gerald Holt said, as if that settled something. Lydia thanked them and left, and did not think about Louis Boone again for another week, until she needed someone to fix the cracked chalkboard, and Mac Credy at the general store told her that Louis Boone was the best carpenter within 30 miles and could be hired for reasonable work. She rode out to his property on a Wednesday afternoon in October, the air sharp and clean and carrying the smell of grass and distance. She found the house first, which stopped her horse in her tracks for a moment. It was beautiful. Not in a showy way, but in the way that honest work becomes beautiful when it is done with enough care. The white pine of the porch posts had been planed smooth and painted. The rose bushes along the front were not yet blooming, being newly planted, but they were staked and healthy. The porch was wide enough to hold a table and chairs with room to spare. The whole structure sat on the plain with a kind of quiet confidence, as if it knew exactly what it was and was not concerned about anyone's opinion of it. Louis Boone was on the porch when she rode up. He was sanding something. She couldn't tell what from a distance, and he looked up when he heard the hoofbeats and stood, the way men of his generation were raised to stand when a woman approached. He was taller than she had expected from the descriptions people had given her, which had focused on his quietness and somehow made her picture a smaller man. He was not small. He was broad through the shoulders and long-limbed, with the kind of sun-darkened skin that came from years of outdoor work. His hair was dark and needed cutting, and his jaw had a day or two of beard on it. He was, she noticed with the detached clarity she brought to most observations, a very good-looking man. Mr. Boone, she said, bringing her horse to a stop at the edge of the porch steps. That's right, he said. My name is Lydia Fletcher. I'm the new schoolteacher, Mr. Mac Credy at the general store suggested you might be able to help with a repair at the schoolhouse. He came down the porch steps and took her horse's bridle, which was a courtesy she had not expected and which she appreciated. What kind of repair? He asked. She told him about the chalkboard, and he listened with his whole attention, which was also something she had not expected. Men had a habit, she had noticed, of listening to about half of what she said and then starting to form their response. Louis listened to all of it, "I can take a look at it," he said. "I can come into town Friday if that suits." "Friday is fine," she said. She hesitated because she was not a woman who hesitated often, and then she said what she was thinking, which was her habit. "Your house is lovely, Mr. Boone." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile and not quite pain, but something in between that was more honest than either. "Thank you," he said. "It's very large," she said, and she said it kindly but directly. He looked at her for a moment, and she did not look away, and then he said, "I know." She waited, and when he didn't say anything else, she didn't push. She had made her opening. She would let him take it or leave it. She gathered her reins, and he stepped back from the horse. "Friday," she said. "Friday," he agreed. She rode back to town with the October wind at her back and the image of that house, wide and waiting, sitting in her mind like a question she couldn't stop turning over. He came to the schoolhouse on Friday morning as promised, arriving before she did, which she found when she came in at 7:30 to find him already examining the chalkboard. He had brought his tools in a worn leather case, and he handled them with the ease of long familiarity. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he said without turning around. "The crack runs through to the back. The board's mounted wrong. It was put up green and warped as it dried. I'll need to take it down and reframe it." "How long will that take?" "Couple of hours. I can have it back up today if I work straight through." "The children will be arriving at 8, she said. "I can keep them outside for the morning if the weather holds." "I'll be done before noon," he said. He was as good as his word. She taught the children their morning lessons on the grass outside the schoolhouse, which they found far more interesting than their usual confinement, and by the time she brought them in for their afternoon session, the chalkboard was remounted, reframed, and solid on the wall. The crack was gone. The surface was flatter and truer than it had been. She could see that immediately. Louis was packing his tools when she came in, the children filing past him to their desks with the muted curiosity children show toward adults in their space. "What do I owe you?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. She opened her mouth to object. "Consider it a contribution to the school," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not dismissive but simply final, the way a man states something he has decided and is comfortable with. She thanked him and meant it and watched him go. She thought about that firmness on her walk back to Mrs. Aldridge's that evening. It was not the firmness of arrogance. It was something quieter. The firmness of a man who knew his own mind and didn't need applause for the decisions he made with it. She found herself riding out past his property more often than she could entirely explain by the directness of her route. The house was visible from the road if you looked east, and she looked east. In the mornings, she could sometimes see the lamp already burning in the kitchen window before the sun was fully up, and she knew without being told that he was an early riser, that he had probably been up since before 5, and had put in more work by 7 than most men managed in a full day. It was November when she saw him next, at the church social that Mrs. Aldridge dragged her to with cheerful insistence. The social was held in the church fellowship hall, and involved a great deal of food brought by the women of the congregation, and a great deal of standing around talking in groups determined largely by who knew whom. Louis Boone stood at the edge of one of these groups, holding a plate of food and listening more than he talked, which was consistent with everything she had heard about him. She crossed the room to him with the directness that was her nature, because she did not see the point of not doing so. "Mr. Boone," she said. He turned, and something in his face shifted, not in a dramatic way, but she caught it, the slight easing of whatever expression he wore by default. "Miss Fletcher," he said. "How is the house coming along?" she asked. "Almost finished," he said. "Are you pleased with it?" He thought about this in the way she had begun to recognize as characteristic a brief actual pause, as if he took her questions seriously enough to give them real consideration rather than a reflexive answer. "I am," he said. "Yes." She had a plate of food, too, and they stood together at the edge of the gathering and talked, not loudly, not in the way people perform conversation at social functions, but in the way two people talk when they are actually interested in what the other person is saying. He asked about the school, the children, how she was finding Granger's Hollow after Ohio. She asked about the wheat, the land, the winter preparations for livestock. She asked about his family, where he was from originally, and he told her he was from Missouri, that he had come west after the death of his mother, who had been the last of his immediate family, and that he had bought the Kansas land because it was good and cheap, and because Missouri had held more grief than he wanted to keep living inside. He said this plainly, without drama, and she received it the same way. "I'm sorry about your mother," she said. "It was 4 years ago," he said. "Though I'm not sure that makes it smaller." "I don't think time makes it smaller," she agreed. "I think it makes it more familiar. You learn to live around it rather than through it." He looked at her then with an attention that was different from his usual attentiveness, something sharper and more personal. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly right." They stayed in that corner of the fellowship hall for the better part of an hour, and people noticed, because in a town of that size people noticed everything, and the noticing was accompanied by the particular kind of interest that a community takes when two of its unattached members find a reason to stand together longer than social obligation strictly requires. Silas Pruitt's wife, whose name was Ruth, nudged her husband and said, "Look at Louis Boone." Silas looked. Louis was talking to the new schoolteacher and appeared, for the first time in anyone's recent memory, to be not quite as closed off as usual. "Well," Silas said, in the tone of a man who has observed something that surprises him. "Well," Ruth agreed. December came with a hard cold that settled over the Kansas plain like a weight. The snow fell in sheets and the temperature dropped below what was comfortable for man or animal. Lydia walked to the schoolhouse each morning wrapped in 3 layers and arrived to find the wood stove already burning, which puzzled her until she discovered, by means of arriving earlier than usual one morning, that Louis Boone stopped at the school each morning on his way into town to start the fire. She confronted him about this in the most Lydia Fletcher way possible, which was to walk into Mac Credy's general store where he was purchasing winter supplies and say, without preamble, "Are you the one starting the fire at the school each morning?" He looked at her across a stack of flour sacks. "Yes," he said. "Why?" she asked. "Because you get there at 7:30 and the children come at 8, and a cold room is hard to warm up fast enough," he said, "and because it's not out of my way." She looked at him for a moment, this man who repaired her chalkboard and started her fire and asked for nothing and explained himself without embarrassment. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than the simple words could hold. "It's not a problem," he said, which was the only acknowledgement he needed. She bought her own supplies and he bought his, and they walked out into the winter morning together and stood for a moment in the cold air, their breath making small clouds between them. "Would you like to come to supper?" she asked. "At Mrs. Aldridge's this Friday evening. Mrs. Aldridge hosts supper on Fridays and she has told me I may invite guests." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said, "I'd like that." The Friday supper was a turning point, though neither of them would have named it as such at the time. Mrs. Aldridge was a gifted cook and a skilled conversationalist who had the ability to draw people out without seeming to try. She brought out a roast chicken and potatoes and her prize-winning apple pie, and over the course of the meal managed to learn more about Louis Boone than the rest of Granger's Hollow had managed to in 4 years. He had grown up on a farm in Missouri, the son of a farmer and a schoolteacher. His eyes went to Lydia when he said this, a brief acknowledging glance. He had 3 years of schooling at a county school, and had educated himself further through whatever books he could get his hands on, which were not many but were read thoroughly. He had come to Kansas with enough money to purchase his land and a small amount besides, and had built his operation through 4 years of hard work and careful management. He had never had a business partner, never taken out more debt than he could see his way clear to repaying, and had the farm running profitably enough that he was considering adding a small dairy herd to supplement the wheat income. Mrs. Aldridge listened to all of this and then said, with the directness she shared with her boarder, "And what about the house, Mr. Boone? Lydia tells me it's nearly finished. It sounds like a fine place." "It is a fine place," he said. He paused and then said something he had not said to anyone in 2 years of building. I built it with a family in mind, not a specific family, just the idea of one. The table was quiet for a moment after that. Mrs. Aldridge nodded, and Lydia looked at the apple pie, and Louis looked at his hands, and then Mrs. Aldridge said, "Well, I think that's a very hopeful way to build a house." And the conversation moved on, but not before something had shifted in the room, something that had been waiting for the right moment to move. The winter deepened, and Louis Boone became a regular Friday supper guest at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house. He and Lydia fell into the habit of walking after supper when the weather permitted, circling the north end of town in the blue-gray winter dark, their boots crunching on snow-packed ground, talking about everything they knew and some things they were still figuring out. She told him about Ohio, about Millfield, about the man she had left behind, not in full detail but in outline, enough that he understood without her having to say all of it. He did not press her for more than she offered, and she found this, of all his qualities, the one that disarmed her most thoroughly. She was accustomed to the world requiring her to defend her privacy. Louis Boone simply left her privacy intact and let her choose what to share. She told him about her own family, her father, who had been a judge in Millfield and who had died when she was 19, and her mother, who had remarried a year later and moved to Cincinnati, and her younger sister Clara, who was 17 and still living with their mother, and the new husband, who was not a bad man but was not particularly interested in people who were not himself. "You've been on your own for a while," he said, on one of these evening walks in January when the cold was brutal and they were both bundled to the eyes. "I have," she said. "I don't find it as frightening as some people seem to think I should." "No," he said. "I've noticed that about you." She looked at him sideways as they walked. "What have you noticed?" "That you're not afraid of things that are difficult," he said. "You look at something difficult and you work out how to handle it. You don't spend a lot of time wishing it weren't difficult." She was quiet for a moment because this was such a precise description of something she had never quite found words for in herself. "My father used to say that wishing a problem away was the longest path to solving it," she said. "He sounds like he was a wise man." "He was," she said, and the fondness in her voice was real and unguarded. They turned at the north corner of town and started back, and Louis said, without looking at her directly, "I'd like to show you the house, when it's fully finished, if you'd like to see it." "I would like very much to see it," she said. The house was finished in February of 1881. Louis spent the last weeks of January and the first weeks of February doing the final work, hanging the interior doors, painting the upstairs rooms, setting the last of the limestone mantelpiece in the sitting room. On the first Saturday of February, when the weather gave them a day that was cold but not brutal, with a white winter sun that laid long shadows across the snow-covered ground, he drove into town in his wagon and collected Lydia Fletcher. Mrs. Aldridge watched them leave from the front window of the boarding house with her hands folded under her chin and a private smile on her face. The drive out to the property took 20 minutes, which was long enough for Lydia to ask questions and Louis to answer them, and for the familiar ease they had built over months of Friday suppers and evening walks to settle between them warmly. She was wearing her heaviest coat and a woolen scarf the color of dark red apples, and she sat straight in the wagon seat with her hands in her lap, looking at the Kansas country around her with the focused interest she brought to everything. When the house came into view around the cottonwood line, she didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked. The winter sun hit the white-painted porch posts and the good, clean lines of the roof, and the house stood on the plain in its completeness, and she understood, looking at it, that it was not just a building. It was an argument for a certain kind of life. "Louis," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the formality of his surname attached, and they both noticed it without commenting on it. "It's beautiful. Come inside," he said. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand steadying hers, warm through both their gloves, and walked her up the porch steps. The front door opened into a short hallway that led to the sitting room on the left and the kitchen straight ahead. He had laid a fire in the sitting room that morning, and the room was warm, the fireplace burning with the steady confidence of good limestone construction. The pine floors gleamed. The walls were painted a cream color that caught the light from the windows. The room was empty of furniture. He had a bed and a table and 2 chairs and not much else, but the architecture of it was generous and right. She walked through all of it, room by room, quietly. He followed at a respectful distance, watching her. She looked at the kitchen with its built-in cabinets, running her hand along the smooth joinery the way he had run his hand along every post before he was done with it. She looked at the small room behind the kitchen with its window facing the garden beds. "What is this room for?" she asked. He had wondered who would ask first and whether he would answer. "I thought," he said carefully, "it might be a good room for reading or for whatever needed doing quietly away from the rest of the house." She looked at the window, at the garden beds just visible through it, dormant in the winter snow. She looked back at him. "You planned this house very thoroughly," she said. "I had a lot of time to think about it," he said, "while I was building." She looked at him with those gray eyes that missed nothing and said, "What were you thinking about?" It was the question nobody in Granger's Hollow had asked him. It was, he understood, the question that everything had been building toward. "About what kind of life I wanted," he said, "not just for myself. I knew early on that a house this size wasn't meant for one person. I was building it on faith, I suppose, the faith that the right life would come along to fill it." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled in the sitting room behind them. Outside, the winter sun moved a degree in its arc and the light through the garden window shifted. "And has it?" she asked quietly. "Come along?" "I think it might be starting to," he said. The words were careful and honest, and asking nothing she had not already opened the door to. She looked at him, and then she looked away, not from discomfort but from the particular overwhelm of feeling something you had not entirely expected to feel so strongly. "Tell me more about the garden," she said, which was her way of asking for a moment to breathe. He told her about the garden. He told her he had turned the beds but not planted anything yet because he had been waiting for spring, and because he paused here and she heard the honesty in the pause because he had wanted the person who planted it to choose what went in it. She was quiet for a moment after that. Then she said, "I grew up with a kitchen garden. My mother kept one. She always said it was the most honest form of work there is, because it never lets you take credit for more than you've done." "That sounds right," he said. She stayed for most of the afternoon. He made coffee on the small stove he had set up in the kitchen, and they sat on the porch in their heavy coats with their coffee cups, looking out at the winter land, and they talked and were sometimes quiet in the way of people who are comfortable with each other's silence. Before he drove her back to town, she stood on the porch steps and turned around and looked at the house one more time. "You should be proud of it," she said. "I am," he said, "now more than before somehow." The way he said it left no ambiguity about his meaning, and she let the words stand without deflecting them, which was its own kind of answer. The spring of 1881 arrived the way Kansas springs always did, sudden and forceful, the cold breaking in a matter of days, the grass greening almost overnight, the sky opening up to a blue so deep and wide it seemed to promise more than one season could deliver. The wheat Louis had planted in the autumn began to show green in the fields, and the rose bushes along Lydia's schoolhouse path. She had planted a cutting from his bushes, with his permission, and a good deal of amusement on both sides about the carrying of rose cuttings in a coat pocket across 20 minutes of wagon ride, put out their first leaves. They fell into a rhythm that was not yet courtship in any declared sense, but was beyond what friendship could fully explain. He continued starting the fire at the school each morning. She continued hosting him at Friday suppers. They rode out together on Sunday afternoons when the weather allowed, sometimes to his property, and sometimes simply along the river road to the east, talking or not talking as the day suggested. She helped him plant the kitchen garden in April, kneeling in the turned earth in an old dress she'd brought for the purpose, her hair coming loose from its pins in the spring wind, laughing at something he said about the proper spacing of carrot rows. He watched her laugh and felt something in his chest that was not grief and not longing, but was something else entirely, something warmer and more alive, and he recognized it for what it was with a clarity that surprised him with its force. He had not said it yet. He was a man who moved carefully, who built things from the foundation up and did not skip steps. But he was also a man who had spent 2 years building a house for a life he had not yet found, which meant that underneath the carefulness there was faith, and underneath the faith there was courage, and he was finding both now in ways he had not expected. It was Gerald Holt's wife, Martha, who created the occasion, though she would have said she only helped along what was plainly going to happen anyway. She organized a spring dance in the church hall, because the church hall was the town's public space for any gathering that needed more floor than the saloon offered and less solemnity than a service required. She sent invitations to everyone in the vicinity, including, with deliberate intent, Louis Boone and Lydia Fletcher on the same card. They arrived separately, Lydia with Mrs. Aldridge, Louis on his own, and found each other within 10 minutes in the way that people find each other when they are the person the other person is looking for. The hall was crowded and warm, lit by lamplight, a fiddle and a guitar playing in the corner. People danced in the open space and stood in groups around the edges, and the noise of it was the specific cheerful noise of a community letting itself have a good time. Louis asked her to dance. It was the first time he had asked her anything in quite so direct and personal a manner, and she accepted with a formality that was slightly punctured by the fact that she was clearly pleased to be asked. She was a competent dancer. He was not particularly graceful, but he was steady and honest about his limitations, which she found charming in a way that surprised her. They danced twice in a row, and then stepped out onto the side porch of the hall to cool down, and stood in the warm spring night with the music coming through the wall, and he looked at her and said, without preparation, without the careful building up he usually employed, "Lydia, I would like to court you properly, if you're willing." She looked at him. The night air was warm and smelled of grass and spring mud and the faint sweetness of whatever Mrs. Holt had put in the punch. The fiddle inside was playing something hopeful. "I thought you already were," she said, and there was a smile at the corner of her mouth that was the first fully unguarded smile she had given him. He laughed. It was a short, genuine laugh, and she had heard him laugh only a handful of times, and it did something specific to her every time. "Fair enough," he said. "Then I would like to continue." "I think," she said, "that you should." He reached out and took her hand, which was a forward thing to do, and he knew it, but he also knew she was not a woman who would object to what she meant, and she meant this. She did not object. She looked down at their joined hands and then back up at him, and what was in her eyes then was not complicated or ambiguous or requiring of interpretation. They went back inside and danced again, and this time people noticed in a more definitive way, and the noticings were all of the warm and approving kind, because the town had spent 2 years wondering about Louis Boone's house and his heart, and here was the beginning of an answer, and it was a good one. The spring deepened into summer. The wheat grew tall, and the garden at Louis's house came up in orderly rows. The carrot rows they had argued over, and the bean poles and the tomato plants and the herbs Lydia had added from seeds she sent away for, writing to a nursery in St. Louis with precise specifications. She came out to the property on many Sunday afternoons now, sometimes riding her own horse, a patient bay mare named Thursday, and sometimes in the wagon with Louis if they had run into each other in town on Saturday. The garden grew and the house was lived in, even though Lydia still lived at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house, because the proprieties mattered, and she was the town's schoolteacher, and she understood that her respectability was also the respectability of her school. But she cooked in the kitchen sometimes, and she had a favorite chair on the porch where she sat in the evenings when she was there, And there was a cup in the kitchen cabinet that she thought of as hers without quite saying so. And these small claims on the house were noticed and accepted by Louis with a quiet satisfaction that he kept inside, but which occasionally showed itself in the way he stood when she was there, more settled, as if the house had found its center. It was in June that things became complicated, not in a dramatic way, but in the way that real life complicates things, through the arrival of circumstances that require decisions. A letter came to Lydia from the school district in Wichita, which was a much larger and more established city, offering her a position at a girls' academy there at twice the salary she was earning in Granger's Hollow, with housing provided and a full set of teaching materials and a library that was, the letter said, quite extensive. She read the letter twice in her room at Mrs. Aldridge's, and then sat with it in her lap for a long while, looking out the window at the Kansas summer rolling past outside. Then she did what she had learned over months to do when something mattered. She rode out to Louis's property. She found him in the wheat field, checking the height and the heads which were filling out well. He saw her coming and walked to meet her at the edge of the field, and something in her face told him before she said anything that this visit was different from the usual Sunday afternoon. She showed him the letter. He read it carefully, standing in the summer light with the wheat moving behind him, and then folded it and handed it back. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking several things at once," she said. "I'm thinking about the children here who are just getting used to consistent teaching. I'm thinking about the salary, which is substantial. I'm thinking about the library." She paused. "I'm thinking about this," she said, and gestured in a way that encompassed the wheat field and the house behind it and him standing in front of her. "And I'm having some difficulty deciding which thinking is loudest." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, with the directness that was his equivalent of her own, "I don't want you to go." "I know," she said, "but I don't want you to stay for the wrong reasons," he said. "I don't want you to give up something real because I was too slow to say what I should have said months ago." She looked at him. "What should you have said months ago?" "That I love you," he said. "That I knew it in February, on the porch, drinking coffee in the cold, and I've been moving toward it since then in the way I move toward everything, which is apparently too carefully." The summer air around them was warm and still and smelled of wheat and earth. Thursday, the mare cropped grass behind her with complete indifference to the human moment taking place nearby. "Louis," she said. "You don't have to answer me today," he said. "I'm just saying it because it's true, and because it needed to be said before you make any kind of decision. You should know where you're standing." She looked at him for a long, clear moment, and then she stepped forward and put her hand against his chest, over his heart, the way she had once put her hand against the limestone mantelpiece in the sitting room, feeling for the solidity of it, the truth of its construction. He covered her hand with his and stood very still. "I love you too," she said. "I've known it for some time and been nearly as slow about saying it as you were." He exhaled, and the exhale was more than air. It was 2 years of faith, of building towards something unnamed, of Friday suppers and morning fires and planted gardens, of a house that was too big for one person finally understanding why. She wrote back to Wichita declining their offer, citing personal obligations in Granger's Hollow that were too important to leave. She wrote this letter at the kitchen table at Louis's house, using his ink and pen, and when she was done, she looked around at the kitchen, at the cabinets he had built, at the garden visible through the window, and felt that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Louis Boone asked Lydia Fletcher to marry him in July of 1881, on the front porch of the house he had spent 2 years building. In the long summer evening, when the light turned gold across the Kansas plain, and the first of the roses he had planted along the porch were just coming into bloom. He had a ring, a simple gold band with a small dark stone that he had ordered from a jeweler in Wichita months before he quite had the right to, which was evidence of the faith he ran on underneath the carefulness. She said yes before he had finished asking, which was not a surprise to either of them. They were married in the church in September. by the minister whose wife had once prayed for Louis after Chester Webb told her about his bachelor house. The whole of Granger's Hollow came, or near enough to the whole of it that the church was full, and people stood in the doorway. Mrs. Aldridge cried with a frankness that she did not attempt to hide. Silas Prout stood in the back and felt vindicated in a way he could not quite articulate. Lydia wore a dress she had made herself from a blue-gray fabric that was almost the color of her eyes, and she carried a small bunch of the roses from the porch, the deep red ones that had been the first to bloom. Louis wore his best coat and had his hair cut the day before, and stood at the front of the church with the composure of a man who has built toward this moment from the foundation up, and is not surprised to find it solid. The minister performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity and occasional warmth. When he reached the vows and Louis said them, he said them looking directly at Lydia, and his voice was steady and clear and completely without performance. She said hers the same way, in the particular way she had of meaning things entirely. The whole congregation was quietly moved by the sincerity of it, which was more affecting than ceremony. After the wedding they had a dinner in the church hall, and then Louis drove his wife home in the wagon in the September dusk, and they arrived at the house and went in together, and for the first time the house was not too big for its occupants. For the first time, standing in the sitting room by the limestone fireplace with the September dark settling outside and the lamp turned up warm, Louis Boone felt the house settle around them as if it had been waiting for exactly this, which perhaps it had. "How does it feel?" Lydia asked, looking around the sitting room which they had now furnished properly, a settee from a furniture dealer in Caldwell, 2 good armchairs, a braided rug that Mrs. Aldridge had given them as a wedding gift, a bookshelf that Louis had built and Lydia had filled. "Right," he said simply. "It feels right." She leaned against him, her head against his shoulder, looking at the room they had made together. "Does," she agreed. The autumn of 1881 and the winter that followed were the best months of Louis Boone's life, and he would have said so plainly if asked, because he was a man who could name a good thing when he was living inside it. Lydia continued teaching. There was no question of her stopping. She loved it too much and the children needed her, and Louis continued farming, and they built the daily life of a household together with the same unhurried care that he had brought to the building of the house itself. She was not a woman who needed to be managed or directed or explained to. She had her own sense of how things should run, and she ran them with efficient competence, and Louis' sense of how things should run was compatible enough with hers that they had very few occasions of genuine disagreement. And on the occasions they did disagree, they both had the capacity to argue their position and then listen to the others, which made disagreements productive rather than corrosive. She planted spring bulbs in the garden beds in October, knowing she would not see them until April, and he found this, the faith of planting things you would not see bloom for months, deeply characteristic of her and deeply admirable. He drove her to school every morning and started the fire and then went back to his own work, and in the evening she was home when he came in from the fields, and the kitchen smelled of whatever she had been cooking, and the lamp was lit in the sitting room, and it was so far from the 4 years of coming into an empty dark house that he sometimes stood in the doorway for a moment just to take the measure of the difference. She noticed him doing this once. "You're doing that thing again," she said from the kitchen doorway, drying her hands on a cloth. "What thing?" he said, standing in the door looking at the room like you're not entirely sure it's real. He came inside and shut the door behind him. "Sometimes I'm not entirely sure it is." She came forward and put her hands on either side of his face, which was a gesture of such uncomplicated affection that it made him feel, every time, as though the last 4 solitary years had been preparation for exactly this. "It's real," she said. "I'm here." "I know," he said. "That's what I'm appreciating." By the following spring it became clear that the house was going to be filled in a new way, because Lydia was expecting their first child. She told him on a March evening, matter-of-factly and with a steadiness that was completely her own, and he sat down rather abruptly on the kitchen chair and looked at her with an expression that moved through several things: surprise, which was brief, and then a sudden overwhelming warmth that was not brief at all. "Are you well?" he asked when he found words. "I am very well," she said, and she was smiling, the full smile that transformed her face, and he stood back up and held her. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, as Lydia's constitutions generally were, and she taught school until the summer, when the heat and the physical realities of the final months made it impractical, and even then she went in twice a week to keep the older children's reading on track. Louis rode with her on these days and waited outside with enormous patience, reading or working on something with his hands. There were moments in that summer when the situation of the frontier was brought close and real, not to their household directly, but near enough that it could not be ignored. The displacement of the Cheyenne and other peoples who had lived on this land for generations before any white settler arrived was an ongoing and wretched fact, something Lydia had read about and thought hard about, and something Louis, who had been in Kansas long enough to understand the full scope of it, carried as a weight that had no easy resolution. They talked about it sometimes, on the evenings when the news came through of another removal, another confrontation, another instance of official injustice conducted at government direction. Neither of them had any power over these events, and both of them knew it, and the knowing sat between them as a kind of sorrow for what was being done in the name of the settlement they were part of. Lydia said once that she thought the best thing they could do, without any illusions about the limits of it, was to conduct their own lives with the kind of honesty and fairness that left as little harm as possible in its wake. Louis agreed, and added nothing, because he could not add to it, and she was right. Their son was born in August of 1882, a healthy boy with his mother's gray eyes and his father's unfortunate tendency to be awake before 5 in the morning. They named him James Robert Boone, for Louis's father and Lydia's father, who between them represented two good men who were no longer in the world, but had left something worth naming a child after. Louis held his son in the front room of the house he had built, standing by the limestone fireplace, and felt the specific gravity of the moment of bringing a new life into the rooms he had built on faith, of the faith being answered in ways he had only half articulated even to himself. Lydia, in bed but not resting much, called out from the bedroom, "Is he still breathing?" "He's breathing," Louis called back. "Then stop staring at him and bring him back." He brought the baby back, still smiling, and sat in the chair by the bed, and Lydia took the baby from him and looked down at the small, serious face with an expression that Louis wanted to put somewhere permanent, somewhere that would not fade. James Robert Boone grew. Children do this with an insistence that occasionally startles even the people who are watching it happen every day. He grew and became a person with opinions, and a specific way of approaching the world that was some combination of both his parents and also entirely himself. He liked the animals, the horses and the chickens and the small dairy herd that Louis had added in 1882, 6 cows who turned the grass of the pasture into income, and whose care James took an early and inconvenient interest in. He liked the garden, particularly the process of digging, which he applied with less discrimination than the carrots appreciated. He liked the books his mother read him in the evening, and had opinions about which ones deserved rereading and which ones did not. The house was not too big for 3 of them. It was, in fact, exactly the right size, which was what Louis had been building for. In the spring of 1884, Lydia Fletcher arrived in Granger's Hollow. She was 20 years old, and she arrived with a letter from Lydia's mother explaining that the situation in Cincinnati had become, for Clara, untenable in ways the letter was not entirely specific about. Lydia read between the lines with the precision of a woman who knew her family's patterns of understatement, and what she read was that Clara had needed to leave and had nowhere else to go. She arrived on the stage from Dodge City the same way Lydia had arrived almost 4 years before, with a carpet bag, and a look of determination over uncertainty. Lydia met her at the stage, James on her hip, and pulled her younger sister into a hug that was long enough to convey everything the letters had left out. "You're here," she said. "I'm here," Clara said, and held on. The small room behind the kitchen, the one Louis had built for quiet work, the one he had said might be good for reading, became Clara's room. It was snug and comfortable, with the window looking out at the garden and enough space for a bed and a small desk, and Clara settled into it with the relief of a person who has been somewhere loud and unkind, and is now somewhere quiet and decent. She was not planning to stay forever, she said. She had some ideas about what she might do. She had always been good with numbers, better than Lydia even, and she thought there might be a way to use that. Louis, who kept his own farm accounts with meticulous care and had a sense of the value of such a talent, thought she might be right. Clara stayed through the summer, helping with the house and the garden, and James, who adored his aunt with the wholehearted enthusiasm of small children for anyone who is new and interesting. By the autumn, Louis had spoken to Gerald Holt, who ran the small bank in Granger's Hollow, which had by now grown to include a second general store, a doctor's office, and a small hotel, about whether there was work available for a young woman with a facility for bookkeeping. Gerald Holt, who was a practical man and somewhat ahead of his time on the question of women in business functions, said there might be, and there was. Clara went to work at the Granger's Hollow Bank in November of 1884, wearing her second-best dress and sitting behind a desk with the ledger books, and applying herself with the focused intensity that was, Lydia recognized, the family trait. She was good at it, and it was clear immediately, and Gerald Holt told Louis, the next time Louis came into the bank, that his sister-in-law was one of the quickest minds he had encountered for figures, and that he hoped she would stay on. Louis told Lydia, and Lydia told Clara, and Clara smiled, and said she thought she might stay on for a while after all. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was a hard one, harder than the winters that had preceded it. The cold came early and stayed long, and there were nights when the temperature dropped low enough that Louis worried about the cattle and went out after dark to check on them, and Lydia stayed awake until he came back, sitting by the fire with a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading. One of those nights, very late, when he had come back in and they were both sitting by the fire, warming back up, she said, "I've been thinking." "About," he said, "about the school. The children who aren't coming because they're too far out and the winter's too hard." She paused. "There are 4 families I know of east and south of town whose children didn't come in October and won't come until spring. They're missing months of schooling." "What are you thinking?" he asked, because he knew she was thinking something specific. "I'm thinking there should be a way to reach them," she said. "Some kind of arrangement for the hard months, maybe a series of visits or materials sent out," or she stopped. "I haven't worked it out fully." "You will," he said. "You're very confident about that." "I've watched you work things out for 3 years," he said. "I know how it goes." She looked at him, at the man sitting across from her in the firelight, the man who had built this house from faith, who had started fires in cold schoolrooms at 6 in the morning, who had held their son with the particular reverence of someone receiving something they had hoped for without quite daring to believe in. She felt the full weight of what they had built together, the life of it, the warmth of it against the howling winter outside. "I'm very glad I came to Granger's Hollow," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." She did work it out. By the following autumn she had arranged with the town council a system of winter outreach, whereby materials and lesson packets were carried out to the remote families by a rider on a weekly basis, and she made 4 visits herself through the worst of the winter months to check on progress and answer questions. Louis drove her on these visits, refusing to let her go alone in the cold, and they made the trips together in the covered wagon with James bundled between them, talking about the families they would visit and the children's progress, and whether the road would hold or whether they would need to go around. These trips became another thread in the fabric of their life together, part of the particular pattern of it, the work they did, the things they cared about, the way that caring about the same things had made them a unit in a way that was deeper than ceremony or contract. In 1886, their second child was born, a girl this time, with Louis's dark hair and Lydia's gray eyes, and a voice that could fill the whole house from the smallest room. They named her Margaret Rose, for the roses along the porch and for Lydia's grandmother, and she was from her first days a person of strong opinions and considerable volume, which turned out to be a combination the household managed with a love that was sometimes also exhausted. James, who was 4, regarded his sister with the philosophical resignation of a firstborn encountering competition, and then, within a few weeks, with a protective affection that never quite left him. He was that kind of child, serious in his loyalties, once they were formed. Lydia, holding Margaret in the small bedroom that had been theirs since the wedding, looked up one evening to find Louis standing in the doorway, watching them. He had that expression she had come to know well over 5 years, the one where he was measuring something, taking stock of the goodness of a moment. "Come in," she said. "I'm fine here," he said. "Come in anyway." He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter, who had quieted for the moment and was looking at nothing with the distant focus of the very new. "She's going to be difficult," he said, with great affection. "Undoubtedly," Lydia agreed. "She gets it from both sides." He smiled, and it was the full smile that she had come to think of as entirely hers, the one that reached his eyes and rearranged his whole face into something that did things to her still after 5 years, in the way that a very good thing does not diminish with familiarity but deepens. "Are you happy?" she asked him, and she asked it seriously, the way she asked everything. He looked at her, and at their daughter, and then around at the room, the good pine floors, the whitewashed walls, the lamp on the nightstand, the curtain she had made from a fabric she had chosen in Caldwell. At the window, through which on a clear day you could see the edge of the wheat field. At the house around them, which he had built with his own hands for 2 years before he knew who would live in it. "I have been happy since February of 1881, he said, "when I drove you out here in the cold and you put your hand on my chest and told me you loved me." "That was a very good day," she said. "It was the best day," he said. "Every day since has been built on that one." She reached out and took his hand, the gesture that was so habitual between them now that it required no thought, and held it. "Louis," she said. "Yes." "The reading room." He waited. "I think it should become a proper study," she said, "for both of us. There are books that need a home that isn't the sitting room shelves anymore." He considered this. "Clara is still using it as her room," he said. "Clara is considering moving into town," Lydia said. "She mentioned it last week. There's a room available above the bank, and Gerald Holt has offered to subsidize the rent in exchange for her taking on some additional responsibilities." "She's moving up in the world," Louis said, with genuine pleasure for his sister-in-law. "She is," Lydia agreed. "And when she does, I want the reading room." "Then it's yours," he said. "It was always meant for whoever needed it." She looked at him. "You designed it that way deliberately, didn't you, that room?" "I built it on the idea that whoever came to this house would have something they needed to do quietly," he said. "I didn't know what it would be. I built the space and let the life fill it in." She was quiet for a moment, thinking about this, about the way he had built the whole house that way, with intention and faith in equal measure, leaving room for things he couldn't yet name. "You're a remarkable man, Louis Boone," she said. "You've told me that before." "I'll likely tell you again," she said. Clara moved into the rooms above the bank in the spring of 1887, having been promoted to the position of assistant manager, which was a title that Gerald Holt invented specifically for her, because he could not promote her to a title that existed, and had her doing the work of someone twice her seniority, and he was honest enough about the value of her work to want to compensate it. She moved out of the small reading room with gratitude and warmth, and a farewell dinner that Lydia cooked, and that went on for 4 hours because none of them were particularly inclined to end it. The reading room became the study, as Lydia had planned. Louis built a second bookshelf for it, and she brought her teaching books and her reference volumes, and the particular collection of novels she had been accumulating since arriving in Kansas. And he brought the farm ledgers and the almanacs, and the 3 books he owned that were his own rather than hers. The shelves held them together in the way that a shared space holds the people who fill it, as evidence of a life being jointly conducted, with books and tools and the small artifacts of daily work. The years moved the way the best years do, with enough variety to keep them interesting and enough continuity to build something solid. James Boone started at his mother's school in 1887, which presented the specific comedy of being taught by one's own mother with the whole class watching for favoritism and finding none. Lydia treated her son with the same expectations she applied to everyone in the schoolroom, which meant he worked hard and was not allowed to be mediocre on the basis of being hers. He was not mediocre. He was clever in the particular way that children are clever when they have been read to consistently from birth and have had their questions taken seriously. He was also, as he got older, good with his hands in the way his father was, which was the quiet competence of someone for whom the relationship between thinking and making was direct and unbroken. Margaret was everything James was not, which is to say she was loud and social and interested in every person she met as a potential story, which led to the adults of Granger's Hollow developing a complicated affection for her, being charmed by her interest and slightly wary of her retention. Louis added a second barn in 1888, which he built with help this time. He had enough standing in the community by now that offering a day's labor was a way men showed friendship, and 3 of the neighboring farmers came to help with the raising. It was a good day, the kind of day the frontier produced when it was being cooperative men working together in the autumn sun, the smell of fresh-cut wood and dry grass, the satisfaction of a structure going up that would serve real purpose. Lydia brought out a midday meal that could have fed twice the number of workers, because she had a deep-seated aversion to anyone being inadequately fed on her account, and the men ate in the shade of the new frame and talked farming and weather and politics and the changes in the county, and Louis sat in the middle of it with the settled ease of a man who has built a life that fits him. He thought, sitting there in the autumn sun with the smell of new lumber around him and Lydia talking to Chester Webb's wife at the edge of the yard, and his son sitting on a fence post watching the men with careful attention, of the winter of 1879, when he had started the foundation of this house alone, with a shovel and a specific kind of faith. He had not known then what he was building toward beyond the general idea of it. He had not known her name or her face or the particular way she looked when she was thinking hard about something important. He had only known that a house this size was not meant for one person, and had built it for the person he had not yet met. He caught her eye across the yard, and she gave him the look she gave him sometimes, not the full smile, but something more private than that, something that was just for him, a look that said, "I know what you're thinking, and yes. Just yes." He nodded, and she turned back to her conversation, and he turned back to his, and the barn frame rose around them in the Kansas autumn light. The winter of 1888 to 1889 was the winter that the country changed, at least in the legal sense. Kansas was not among the territories being organized into statehood in those years, having been a state for nearly 3 decades already. But the opening of the Indian Territory to settlement to the south was a subject of intense discussion throughout the region, and it was a discussion that Louis and Lydia had in the quiet of the study more than once, with the lamp turned up and the children asleep upstairs. The dispossession of the indigenous nations of the territories was not abstract to them, as it perhaps was to people further east who read about it in newspapers and then turned the page. They were on the land. They knew what it meant for land to be someone's livelihood and life. They talked about it with the care that serious people bring to things they cannot fix but should not pretend are not happening. There was a family, the Morin family, who had come down from the northern part of the state and settled on a claim 15 miles south of Granger's Hollow in 1889. They had a daughter of school age, a quiet girl named Helen, who came to the school and sat in the back and worked with a diligence that suggested she understood that learning was a form of security. Lydia watched Helen Morin and thought about all the children who didn't have even the option of a classroom. She thought about this when she sat at her desk preparing lessons, and it made her prepare them more carefully because what she could do was what was in front of her and she would do it as well as possible. She said this to Louis one evening and he said, "That's the same thing every day. You do what's in front of you as well as you can." "Is that how you built the house?" she asked. "It's how I built everything," he said. She looked at him across the study, at the ledger books on his side of the shelves, at the novels on hers, at the farm almanac he had read so thoroughly the spine was failing, at the copy of McGuffey's Reader that she had brought from Ohio that had her name written in the front in the careful hand of a 22-year-old who had not yet left Ohio. She looked at him, at 50 years of morning fires, and planted gardens and questions answered honestly, and love named plainly. He was 37 years old and not yet gray, though there was something at his temples that was coming that would be, she knew, extremely distinguished. He was at ease in his own house in a way that she had understood from the beginning was not always the case for him, that the ease had been built too, the same way the house had, from intention and faith and the daily work of showing up. "I want another child," she said, which was not what she had intended to say but which came out true and clear in the way true things did when she was relaxed enough to let them. He looked at her. "Do you?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I think 3. He considered. "Margaret would have opinions about that." "Margaret has opinions about everything," she said. "She'll manage," he smiled. "Then yes," he said, "if that's what you want." "It's what I want," she said. Their third child, a boy named Daniel Fletcher Boone, was born in 1890 in the spring, on a warm April morning when the rose bushes along the porch were just beginning to leaf. He was a placid, sunlit child from the beginning, easy in his temperament in the way that third children sometimes are, either because the household is finally confident enough for them, or because they absorb the warmth of a house that has been well established long enough to be genuinely warm. James, who was 8, was kind to the baby with the thoughtfulness that characterized him. Margaret, who was 4, was initially suspicious of Daniel's presence and then became his fiercest advocate, which was, given Margaret's nature, a formidable thing to have on your side. The house that Louis Boone had built for 2 years on faith, in the wide Kansas grassland, for a life and a family he could not yet name, held them all. His wife, who had come from Ohio with gray eyes and directness, and a competence that never stopped surprising him in its reach, and his children, who were 3 particular people he loved with a completeness that had no bottom to it, and the daily life that was built from the same materials as the house itself, care and time, and something that sustained all of it underneath, which was love. The years rounded into the 1890s, and the town of Granger's Hollow grew around them, filling in the way towns do when there is enough good land and enough people willing to work it. A second church was built. The school expanded to 2 rooms, with Lydia taking the older children and a younger teacher, a woman named Harriet Smalls who arrived in 1891, and who became Lydia's first genuine friend in Granger's Hollow in the way that colleagues and allies become friends through shared purpose, taking the younger ones. The hotel expanded. Mac Creddy's general store was joined by a competitor, and the 2 stores existed in a competition that was gentlemanly enough and benefited the consumers. Clara Fletcher had made herself an indispensable presence in Granger's Hollow's small commercial life. By 1891, she was managing the bank's accounts with an authority that was not questioned by anyone with sense, and she had developed a reputation across the county for financial acuity that brought people in from Caldwell and further points to seek her opinion on matters of business. She had also, in the way of things, found a person she loved, a quiet, steady man named Thomas Graves, who had come to Granger's Hollow in 1890 to open a surveying practice, and who had come into the bank one Tuesday to open an account, and had stood at the counter while Clara reviewed his papers and had thought, with the particular clarity of a man who has been looking for something without quite knowing what he was looking for, that he had found something. They were married in the fall of 1892, in the same church where Louis and Lydia had been married 11 years before, and Lydia cried with an openness that surprised people who only knew her professional self, and Louis stood next to her and handed her his handkerchief without comment. James Boone turned 12 in 1894 and was already, by that age, dividing his time between the schoolroom and the farm with a purposefulness that suggested he had decided what he was going to do with his life and was not waiting for permission to start doing it. He had his father's hands and his mother's mind, which was a combination that the farming life rewarded the capacity to think carefully about what you were doing while also doing it with physical competence. He took on the morning feeding of the dairy herd without being asked, at 11, and when Louis found out he had been doing it for 3 weeks without mentioning it, he stood in the barn in the early morning light and felt something he could not entirely name, but which was a species of joy. Margaret was learning to read with the same intensity she brought to everything, which meant she was reading ahead of her grade level and consuming every book in her mother's study and presenting opinions about them to her mother over supper, with a certainty that other adults might have found presumptuous, but which Lydia found purely delightful. She was also, at 9, developing the mathematical facility that had skipped a generation from Lydia to Clara, and apparently reappeared in Margaret, which Clara, when she visited on Sundays, found a source of profound personal satisfaction. Daniel was 4 and interested primarily in the horses, the chickens, and the large flat rock by the East Cottonwood tree where he went when he needed to think, which was often enough that the family referred to it simply as Daniel's Rock without explanation. One evening in the spring of 1895, Louis and Lydia sat on the front porch as they often did in the evenings when the weather allowed, in the chairs that had replaced the original porch furniture twice over now, and would need replacing again before too long. The children were inside, James doing his schoolwork at the kitchen table, Margaret reading in the study, Daniel already asleep because he was 5 and the days exhausted him. The evening light was the long honey gold of a Kansas spring evening, the kind that lasted too long to be ordinary, stretching out toward the western horizon in a slow, reluctant burn. The rose bushes along the porch were in full bloom. 15 years of growing had made them what rose bushes become when they are established in good ground and not disturbed, dense and extravagant, covering the full length of the porch front, the blooms deep red in the evening light and the smell of them sweet and specific in the still air. Louis was looking at the wheat field. The spring wheat was up, green and moving slightly in the evening breeze, and it looked as his wheat always looked to him, like a proposition he made to the land each year that the land, so far, had always accepted. Lydia had her feet up on the porch rail, which was not particularly ladylike, but which was the porch rail of her own house on her own Tuesday evening, and she had no interest in ladylike for its own sake. She had a book open in her lap that she was not reading because the evening was too good to give to a book. "I was thinking," Louis said, "about the day I started digging the foundation. Of this house," she said. "Of this house," he said. "Spring of 1879. I was 27 years old and I had a shovel and a plan and no very clear idea what I was building toward, except that it was supposed to be more than one person. What were you thinking, on that day?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the wheat field, at the sky above it going deeper blue as the gold retreated. "I was thinking that the life I wanted was possible," he said. "I didn't have any evidence for it. I just believed it was. And I figured the most honest thing I could do was build toward it as if it were real, even before it was." She looked at him. At the man who had been starting her fire in the cold before she knew he was doing it, who had held out a ring she hadn't known was coming and said words he had been practicing in his own way for years before he found the right person to say them to. "It was real," she said. "It just hadn't happened yet." "Yes," he said. "That's exactly it." The evening settled around them, warm and fragrant, and full of the sounds of a Kansas spring crickets beginning in the grass, somewhere a mockingbird running through its repertoire, the cattle moving in the near pasture. From inside the house came the sound of James turning a page, and then, from upstairs, Daniel talking in his sleep, which was a habit that made them both smile. Lydia closed her book and set it on the small table beside her chair and looked at the roses, at the wheat field, at the wide flat sky above the plain that was going purple at the edges now and would be stars before long. 16 years ago, she said, you started digging a foundation for a life you couldn't see yet. Yes, he said. And it turned out to be this, she said. James and Margaret and Daniel, Clara and Thomas, Mrs. Aldridge's suppers, 23 children in a schoolroom learning to read. 3 dairy cows whose names Margaret has changed twice this month. A porch with roses that took 15 years to look like this. It turned out to be all of this. Yes, he said, and there was in that single syllable the full weight of it, the faith vindicated, the building justified, the house that was too big for one person filled with the specific life that had always been meant for it. She reached across the space between their chairs and found his hand, and he took it, and they sat on the porch in the spring evening, while the stars came out one by one above the Kansas plain, and the house behind them settled into the night with the deep assurance of something built to last. They stayed out there long past when they meant to, because neither of them was particularly inclined to end a good evening early, and there was no reason to. The house was sound. The family was well. The wheat was growing. The roses were in bloom. There was time in the morning for work and time in the evening for this, for sitting in the dark together on the porch of a house that had once been a foundation in a hole, and a man with a shovel and something that could only be called hope. Louis Boone had spent 2 years building a house that was too big for one person. Nobody in Granger's Hollow had ever asked him why, not directly, not in the way that deserved an honest answer. Except one person. Except Lydia, standing in the kitchen on a February afternoon with the winter light through the garden window, who had asked with her hand against his chest and her gray eyes entirely open, and to whom he had answered with everything he had: the house, the ring, the daily work of being the person she deserved, the fire in the school stove in the dark, the rose cuttings carried in a coat pocket across a cold wagon ride, the words said plainly at the front of the church and meant every day since. He had built the house for the life that was coming, before he knew what it was. And the life had come, and its name was Lydia Fletcher, and it was everything he had built toward and more things besides that he had not had the imagination to anticipate but was profoundly grateful for. On the porch in the spring dark, under the enormous Kansas stars, he held his wife's hand and was grateful. It was, and had been for 14 years, enough. It was more than enough. It was the full and completed thing, the life built to last, in a house built to last, in the particular country of the American West in the particular years, when the world was still being made into something. And 2 people had found each other in the middle of all that making, and had made something of their own that stood.